Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and today I wanted to run through the fuel mechanics and how they're working in the game today, and what some of the plans are for the future roadmap of fuel usage and collection and all that kind of stuff. Now, there are two different types of fuel that are being used today in-game, which includes your standard flight fuel, which is being used by your thrusters, which is typically referred to as hydrogen fuel, and then you have the fuel that's being used by your quantum drive, known as quantum fuel. Now, if you look at the ship matrix, you're going to notice that the new item system continues to roll out, and most ships now have dedicated fuel tanks for the different types of fuel, which means you're not just going to be housing quantum fuel and regular fuel in the same tank, you're actually going to be isolating them in different locations. When it comes to actually using your fuel, you essentially are going to be burning fuel anytime you use your thrusters, whether that be primary or maneuvering, and whenever they're firing off. So the simple idea is that if your ship is actively using thrusters to move, you're burning your standard fuel. Now, with that in mind, unless you're engaging your quantum drive for orbital or longer jumps, you're not actually going to be seeing your quantum fuel level drop. They're completely separate. Now, technically, if you're floating or flying decoupled and not doing any maneuvers, you shouldn't really see your fuel reserves drop. Now, if you're using boost or afterburner, those are kind of considered more extreme situations on your ship, and you're going to be using more fuel at the time you're doing those maneuvers, which means that you're going to be seeing your fuel levels drop even faster doing those types of activities. There are some items that you want to consider here, though. Now, first off, if you're flying and you're seeing your fuel level drop some and then climb again, that's because all ships today, with the exception of most snubs, are equipped with fuel scoops or intakes that are collecting gases in space and regenerating what you have available in your tank. Some ships actually have scoops, while others, like the Razors, actually have advanced materials on the wings that kind of absorb the material from space. The richness and availability of these gases are more present in space than in atmosphere today, so flying inside a planetary atmosphere means that you're not going to be collecting fuel, at least for the time being, so as you're flying around, you're going to see that fuel level continue to drop. That being said, there are planned changes to the way all of this is going to work, so you need to kind of keep in mind how that's going to impact things, especially once collection and hydrogen fuel and like flying around gas giants and that sort of thing comes to be a reality. But for today, for example, there's going to be areas that have increased density of gases that you're trying to collect, meaning that eventually you can get more collection at the time, which is going to be important for ships like the Starfarer that are trying to collect large amounts for refining and sale later. Additionally, today you're just collecting hydrogen, as it's the most common element for use right now, but there are going to be other gases that have different levels of performance that you can use. Examples there could include ammonia or nitrogen, where the density of the material ends up yielding better results for your ship. Now, much like we see with mining today, though, especially on a larger scale like the Starfarer, you're going to want to do some math to determine what percentage is going to yield you the best results. So if you see a cloud that has very low levels of ammonia but very high levels of nitrogen, you can probably net a higher profit by opting to go for the nitrogen instead. Now, that's kind of pivoted into the refinery space a little bit, so let's talk about the actual collection process and how that all works. I already mentioned that you've got dedicated tanks for regular and quantum fuel, but since I also mentioned there's different types of fuel available, it is worth pointing out that your standard fuel tanks can only house one type of fuel. So if you're running hydrogen fuel, for example, you can't just decide to start collecting ammonia unless you actually completely purge the contents of your fuel tank to start fresh, which is obviously going to be dangerous in deep space to do, considering you would then not be able to have any movement of your ship to actually collect the new type of fuel that you're going to be targeting. That sort of gameplay is really going to be best suited to being refueled by another ship like a Vulcan or a Starfarer, or more ideally, just picking the type of fuel that you want to use from the station you spawn at before you take off. You would want to also keep in mind the general availability of gas types in the universe to know if you want to leave with something that performs better, but it may end up being actually harder to find that to keep your journey going without relying on some sort of support ship. Now, when you think of fuel, it's obviously easy to think of this as a gas, right? But what the thrusters are actually using is a plasma. So what happens here is that your intakes are going to collect gas from the environment and then funnel it into your fuel tank, where it can be converted into a more concentrated plasma. That process is only going to work for a limited variety of fuel tanks, fuel types, unless you have a ship that actually has a refinery on board, which could open up some other options. So while a standard freelancer would just be limited to fuel options based on the equipment that's on board, a freelancer DUR variant, which does have a refinery, would be able to collect more difficult gases and convert them into a usable plasma, providing more options and better range or performance. Other ships that have refineries that we know of today include the 100 series with that air intake and the Starfarer as well. Now, regardless of your fuel of choice, once it's entered the fuel tank and that's become a usable plasma, it then ends up moving through the power plant where it becomes more energized form of that plasma, which then gets funneled through the thrusters and helps you to move your ship accordingly. In ships like the Starfarer, though, you do have multiple tanks, and they don't necessarily require them to be used by the Starfarer. You can just collect the fuel on the ship. So you collect the gas based on the type that you want, so let's just say hydrogen. It goes through the refinery and dumps into the tanks in the back as a converted plasma that can then be sold or used to refuel other ships. With multiple large tanks on the Starfarer, you could technically go out and have one that's dedicated for hydrogen, one that's dedicated for ammonia, another for nitrogen, another for oxygen, or whatever you opt to collect, with some caveats there being that you can't mix fuel types in the same tank, and you can only collect one fuel type at a time. As far as quantum fuel is concerned, you're not going to be collecting this out in the wild. You're going to be required to be refilled at a station or potentially by Starfarers or Vulcans that are able to actually deliver that out to you. We do know that different gases are eventually going to have different types of performance impacts, such as better efficiency or lower signatures or higher outputs, but we don't have those specifics yet today. However, it does let us know that we have other considerations later in life that are going to impact some of the choices that we make. A racing ship may opt for one type of fuel where a long-range exploration ship may opt for something different. As far as how things are going to change going forward, though, it is going to depend on the ship and the type they're classified as far as how they're going to be collecting fuel. Now, I mentioned earlier that every ship but snubs have intakes today. However, that's planned to change a little bit in the future, with short-range combat ships that are typically considered carrier-based, like the Gladius or the Hornet or the Gladiator. Those types of ships are likely going to lose their intakes, meaning that they're going to have more range restrictions without support or good logistical plans in place. Longer range combat ships like the Vanguard or Retaliator are going to come equipped with these intakes because it's required based on their role. Then we see that ships like Exploration and Industrial and Support ships are all going to have intakes based on their requirements as well, which means that the only real change that you should expect to see is on the smaller fighter side of things. Now, in racing, it's going to depend a little bit on the ship. We see the P-72 has a fuel intake where the P-52 does not. The Razor has the materials on the wings to collect fuel, but the M50 doesn't have anything like that. It just comes with larger tanks from the beginning. That means that picking the right racing ship may be determined by the length of the race that you're competing in, not just like the speed and agility and that sort of thing. So we're expected to get a lot more detail on fuel collection as we get closer to the actual mechanic entering the game. And I expect to see a lot of detail on skill-based requirements like we see with the mining mechanic today once we get that information. And at that point, I'll be sure to do a really detailed breakdown on that. So that's basically where we're at today and where we know we're going in the future. If you guys have questions on any of this, please let me know. Otherwise, hopefully that helps you out. Appreciate you guys watching. Stay tuned for a lot more coming soon, and have a great day. Take care.